all those of Ghent working Ghent and we put them in one big slot. So you have to see what some of us are working on. We start with Sara.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I feel very nervous. This is such an illustrious audience, and I am relatively new to the field of linguistics, so I appeal to your mercy in case I say something outrageous. I shall be forgiven for that reason. This big title is really showing that I want to tell you a story about this Proto-Bantu suffix that has been reconstructed by Merson and other people as id, where the consonant we don't really know what it was. So Merson does not really give a definition in his 1967 paper. He just gives an example. I pulled out here a definition by Doak, which is a classic one. The applied form of the verb is used to indicate that the action when applied on behalf of towards or with regards to some object, but I also pulled out the definition by Schadeberg because to me it's strikingly different from others. So it says the primary function of the dative extension was to tie a non-patient complement closer to the verb. The first of these complements might well have been a locative one. So what I would like to tell you today is that thanks to the seminal work of Trickert in 1983 at UCLA, we know that it does much more than what Bantu grammars tell us. So you have this table also on your handout. I would like you to take a look right now, not at the first and second columns, but rather at the third one. So the first and second show you the form of these things. And the construction of the root and the construction of the applicative, and in the second column you have a kind of abstract and imperfect representation of the structure. But what I want to draw your attention to is this third column. So what I'm arguing today is that this suffix has a more syntax function where it expands the argument structure of its root by introducing an applied phrase. I'm using applied phrase here as a cover term to indicate any morphosyntactic entity introduced by the applicative without specifying its syntactic status. So it could be an NP, a prepositional phrase, anything. The second function is a discourse one. So reflexes of this morpheme introduce a narrow focus, usually a locative applied phrase. They can also expand the scope of a locative applied phrase, etc. So I'm giving you here also a simplified view of the situation. And in type C, this morpheme has a semantic or aspectual-like function where it does not introduce anything, but it rather modifies the meaning of the verb root by adding semantic nuances such as thoroughness, completeness, repetitiveness, excess, etc. So what I would like to discuss today is that is there a conceptual connection or concept that unifies these constructions that I show you here? Why do I even put them on the same table? Because they all have reflexes of id. And if there is such a concept, how are these constructions related diachronically? Okay, so today I would like to discuss the synchrony and diachrony of each one of these types that I just illustrated. So type A syntax, type B discourse, type C aspect. And then I would like to tell you about two scenarios. So in the first one, I'm going to argue that they're not diachronically related, and there were two or more id in Proto-Bantu or further back. In the second scenario, I'm arguing that they're all diachronically related, and there was only one id, and maybe others with other functions that are not related to type A, B, and C. And so that all of these should be reconstructed back to Proto-Bantu. And finally, I would like to propose a new etymology for this suffix. And so we will also briefly touch upon the issue of the source morphology for the so-called Bantu extensions. So the first type, and the entire talk could be about this, so I'm just going to go really fast because I would like to talk more about diachrony than synchrony. So here we have that in this type, as you all know, I am sure, we have a semantic role that can be expressed as an oblique in the construction of the root, and then you can express that same participant as an applied phrase in the construction of the root plus the applicative. Or we also have cases where it is obligatory, meaning we express that specific semantic role in the construction of the root, you need an applicative to express X semantic role. This semantic role is heavily, if not entirely, conditioned by the lexical meaning of the verb root and by context. So type A varies according to whether it is optional or obligatory, but as you have on page 2 of your handout, if you would be so kind to follow me there, another parameter of variation in these constructions is whether the syntactic valence is increased or not. So we can have a clear-cut increase in syntactic valence. In that case, the applied phrase is a syntactic object type B with all a given set of arbitrarily chosen object properties, and the original object, if any, retains all of its object properties. But we can also have no clear-cut increase in syntactic valence, as examples 1 and 2 in your handout show. So there you have in 1 the construction of the root kill in Swana takes 2 participants, I killed the snake. But in 2, if I want to say I killed the snake on a stone, to bring in the prepositional phrase on the stone, I need the applicative. But the only argument property that prepositional phrase has is the fact that it's obligatory in that construction. So the applied phrase can also be a morphosyntactic element with all of but not all object properties, like asymmetrical object constructions, or a historically determined transitional element that has some sort of locative semantics depending on how, on the restructuring of the original Proto-Bantu system where locatives were part of the non-class system. Okay, so what do we know about this type that is attested virtually everywhere from zone A, if I'm not wrong, to zone S? However, as we have discussed already, many Northwest, whatever that means, Bantu languages lost Proto-Bantu morphology, and we also have mergers in certain zones that might hinder our identification of the reflexes of it alone. We also have other Proto-Bantu verbal extensions that can have the same function, such as the reciprocal and in some zone A languages, or the causative ichi. And we also see in this construction type that there is a huge variation and idiosyncrasies on a root-by-root basis within the same language when the applied phrase is a location. So I would like to draw your attention to the handout again. We're still on page 2. So we have some examples from Rugemalira illustrating that in Nyambo, you do not require an applicative if you want to say something like cook in a pot, but you do require it if you want to say cook in the house. Same with wrap in a leaf, no applicative is needed, but we do need it to say wrap in the house. Also notice that in Nyambo, the applicative cannot be used to express the semantic role of instrument, okay? And we go to page 3, we see more examples where, for example, in Nyambo, the root speak requires an applicative to express location. You can see that by comparing 7 and 8, but the root find does not. So 9 and 10 show you that you don't really need an applicative to say he found her in the house. In Debele, the root cry requires an applicative to express location, as you can see by comparing 11 and 12, but the root cook does not. So in terms of diachrony, the Bantuists in this audience and those who are not here have proposed that very likely this morpheme was a valence increasing device further back in Proto-Bantu or even further back. And there is a debate as to whether the original semantic role that was introduced by it in Proto-Bantu was beneficiary, location, or goal, or a mixture of the two. So here you see the supporters of each stance. So I would like to argue, you see that most people propose that the original function was either location or goal. And Treathart proposes that it was likely introducing a beneficiary. I would like to argue that based on a tested direction of change in other language families, what Treathart proposes mainly that we went from a benefactive to a recipient dative, meaning human goal, to a locative allative, meaning spatial goal, and then to time and manner, is unlikely because we have many cases where we have markers that go from allative to dative, so from spatial goal to human goal, from allative to purpose and reason, and further on to complementizers. This would also explain why the applicative shows up in some verbs in subordinate clauses. But we have, to my knowledge, maybe you will prove me wrong, no cases where we have a benefactive going to an allative or a dative going to an allative. We also, another argument that I would like to propose in support of a original location function is this variation and idiosyncrasy on a group-by-group basis within the same language, so that in a way this function would have been older and it would have had more time to develop. This argument is not to be attributed to me, but to Gerard Philipson and Denis Cressel. It doesn't work for all language families, but sometimes it does work. Also, as we will see, all pragmatic functions that are related to the reflexes of this thing have to do with locative phrases. So the question comes in, why is that so? In terms of lexicalizations, if you take a look at the Bantu lexical reconstruction free database, you will see that reconstructions with a frozen id suffix usually introduce goal arguments. So we have reflexes of these in very distant zones. The cases here, yitid poor, which I think it's kind of obvious it meant something like port 8 or port 2. It's attested in zone B and S. We also have need, come, go, in, zone A through S. So based on our phylogenetic tree, we can see that type A is attested virtually everywhere. So it should definitely be reconstructed to a very high node, if not to Proto-Bantu. We now go to type B discourse. In here we have that the applicative introduces still an applied phrase. You can see it there, AP. Usually it is a location-related semantic role that it introduces. And usually, if there are other NPs within the clause, the applied phrase does not precede any other postverbal NP. But what is different with respect to type A is that the applicative does something more than just introducing syntactically a new participant. So it can put the locative applied phrase under some kind of narrow focus, or it can extend the scope of the locative applied phrase to the whole clause. So here again, we go to the examples in your handout on page 3. I would like to point your attention to the fact that these was noted as early as in the 1980s by Kimeni, who has these two examples here you have in 14 and 15. Does everybody have a handout? Yes. We have the children are printing cards on the table, where on the table is an optional participant, and then in 15, again, the children are printing card on the table. This time we have an applicative. The on the table is no longer optional, and Kimeni says that while in 14, everything in the clause is new information, in 15, everything is old information except the locative NP on the table. So it is some kind of new information focus. If we go on page 4, you can also see that this is being recorded in zone L by the Kind and Bostun. So we have in 16, where did the mother put the plate, with an applicative, a question of a WH question, and then the answer, she puts it on the table. The authors are not claiming that the applicative is obligatory in that construction, but it is certainly pragmatically more felicitous than the question without the applicative. Okay. And in 18 and 19, you have an example from the 1980s by Hyman et alia, where you have in 18, I saw Kato while he was in the house, no applicative. I saw Kato while I was in the house, applicative. So here, what the authors argue is that the locative in 18 was part of the verb complement only, was modifying only the verb complement. But in 19, it is outside of the verb complement, and it rather relates to the entire assertion, including the subject relationship to the action. So the question arises then, where is this narrow focus found? So according to Tricart and to some sources that have been collected, certainly in Eastern Bantu, Southwestern, the extension of the scope of the locative phrase to the whole clause is very much less documented, but we find it in Mongo, Ganda, Haya, and Shona. Also, Tricart says and shows in multiple instances that the applicative appears on verbs in WH questions, which is a typical focus environment. And from a recent dissertation from this university, we also know that the applicative shows up in clef constructions, which are also a typical focus environment. So my question here is, are there any other verbal affixes that can have a discourse function besides a syntactic one among the verbal extensions? What do we know in synchrony outside of Bantu? Peterson says not much attention has been paid to the interaction between the applicative and focus, but he says it is sure that there is, in fact, some sort of interaction. Applicative morphemes have been reported with a focalizing function in other Niger-Congo branches, such as Atlantic, and it is attested even in Mayan, where Mora Marin reconstructs both the valence increasing and the focalizing function of that suffix back to Proto-Mayan. So a comment that I have here is, what are the chances if we find this thing as far as Maya and Bantu? Is that just a coincidence? Diachrony. Purcell raises the question in 2004 as to whether the narrow focus allocative phrases is a relic from Proto-Bantu. If also found in the Northwest, based on the argument of parsimony, and based on the fact that this core structure can condense into syntactic structure, so this goes back to the Yvonne argument that an early pragmatic mode or discourse evolves into syntax, it would make much more sense to posit that this focalizing function was also present in the proto-language, and then the syntax function evolved out of it. So we know that topics evolve into subject and topicalization into passivization. What does that tell us with this issue of applicatives and focus? Narrow focus allocative phrases has been proposed by the Kingdom in 2012. Could tie in with an original blockable goal function, in the sense that if we assume that this thing originally introduced goal arguments, which introduced something in immediately post-verbal position, so in a very focused position in Bantu, then this usage got extended, and it got extended to focalizing something that usually in Bantu never appears in immediately after verb position, which would be a locative phrase. And my question here is, can this argument be reversed? So here I am cheating, really, with the little information that I have. Based on Treehurt, I know that there are some relics of the applicative in WH questions in zone H. She finds it in Tumen. We know in Central Western that there are instances of the extension of the scope of the locative applied phrase, and these are the Hyman et al. Examples that you have in your handout. I don't know anything about West Western, and certainly down here we found both focus and the extension of the scope. So should this discourse function, should it be reconstructed or not? We now move on to type C aspect. And here, as you can see, in the construction of the root, you have whatever postverbal entries you might have. In the construction of the applicative morpheme, you might have 1, 2, or 3 applicative suffixes. And there's no introduction of an applied phrase, but the applicative kind of modifies the meaning of the verb root by adding one of these meanings, and maybe more, many more than those that are listed here, to the action described by the root. Sorry, I should go to the handout again. We have on page 4 some, sorry, let me see here. Okay. I'll just go on and tell you that this function has been observed also virtually everywhere, and we do know that other so-called extensions can also do this job. For example, the unreciprocal, and many others, as we have heard from the previous talks. So we have also outside of Africa, or in Africa and outside, applicative morphemes certainly are reported to nuance the meaning of the verb root. Nilo-Saharan is an example, but also in northern Niger-Congo, Boyd talks about it for Obadiah languages, if I'm not wrong. We also know that verbal prefixation in some Indo-European branches, such as Slavic, Baltic, Germanic, Latin, they're also considered to be valence increasing, but also meaning nuancing. And we know also that applicative morphemes can develop into mood markers. So actually, Hyman makes a very strong point with very good arguments that valence-related extensions, not only the applicative but also the causative, are very likely to develop aspectual-like functions or meanings, not only in Bantu but also in Bantu and even outside of Africa. And so he proposes the following evolutionary path, where you go, first you have valence, then you develop kind of an spectral function, then one takes over the other, and then you just end up with a situation, as far as I understand, which is most common in Bantu, where you just have aspect Okay, so, and I want to raise a small point within this type C. Guthrie, in his famous volumes, reconstructs it persisted, comparative series 2189. My question is this a valid reconstruction? So we now go to page 4 of your handout. If you take a look at the data that is there, for example, in 20 from Goma North, you can see that we can have just one applicative morpheme. In lava, la, lirile, we can have one, we can have two, as you see in le, eat, lilile, eat completely. If you take a look at the examples from Bamba, you can see that depending on the shape of the root, you can have up to 3 applicative morphemes. So my question is, was there really an id morpheme, and why was it reconstructed with just 2 id and not 3? And is it not the case that in fact it was just id applicative that also had this function, as we now know, probably Guthrie didn't know, probably he knew and forgot, I don't know, that they can develop a more spectral function. So maybe id should just be id. And going back to Larry's point of before, another question I would like to raise is, was there an additional Proto-Bantu or Proto-Bantuid id diminutive attenuative? I don't know if this makes any sense, but if you take a look at page 5 of your handout, we have that in Bamba, and probably this is true in many other Bantu languages, I'm just not aware of it, you have this suffix that looks exactly like it, and it does exactly the opposite of excess and completeness. So you have push, push a little time, sweep, sweep a little time, become sweet, become a little sweet. So my question there is, was there a phonological merger of a suffix that was different before, you know, and then it just, because of the phonological merger, now we just see it, it looks just like a reflex of id, but how many ids were there? Really, and can this be related to the data found in, Hyman 2018, there's a mistake there, in Zone A and Bantuid. Is there a connection between those two? Does it go beyond Zone A into also other zones like Zone M? Okay, so type C, found everywhere. This is an easy one. So as you can see, the only puzzling one is this one. So what's the story? We have the following situation here. This is just like a summary of the distribution that I've been describing to you so far. So we see that type A and type C is found virtually everywhere. Type B, not so much. So the first scenario that I thought about is type A, B, and C are not historically related. I do believe, however, that given cross-linguistic evidence and Bantu-Bantuid evidence, this scenario is highly unlikely. We know that applicatives can be used to focus constituents in very distant language families such as Mayan. Peterson says that there is really probably some sort of connection between the two functions, but it's not really clear what it is. And syntax-related verb suffixes, we know now that they can evolve into aspect-like verb suffixes. So a possible sub-scenario here would be maybe 2 of these functions are related and came from one id, and then another came from a different id. How to know? But what I would like to argue for is scenario 2, in which type A, B, and C are historically related, and they all go back to Proto-Bantu according to the principle of parsimony. We can discuss whether that is justified or not. So here I'm not doing anything wow. I'm just bringing together the evolutionary path described in Vivon 1979 and then described in Hyman 2014 and 18, where we can go, like discourse we know can evolve into syntax, and we know that syntax can evolve into semantics. So you look at this and you might be asking yourself, sure, great, but how did this actually happen? How did we go from discourse to syntax to semantics? Of course, given the time depth of this thing, we are looking at multiple massive repetitions possibly of grammaticalization paths. So I'm just saying possibly this is what happened. Maybe we started out with syntax and we then evolved into discourse and semantics, or else I would like to hear your opinion about this. And a last question I want to raise at this point is, can the source morphology of this suffix and of other Proto-Bantu verbal extensions tell us anything or be a guide to decide whether one of these evolutionary paths is likely to have happened way back in the past. So I'm just going to go through some facts about source morphology of clade morphemes in the languages of the world. We know from Peterson that they can arise from acquisitions, they can arise from verbs, they can arise from nouns, although that is kind of controversial nowadays. And recently, Rose has shown that they can even arise from apparently verbal classifiers. For Proto-Bantu specifically, there is the hypothesis that these things came from prepositions. So Belz talks about it. There's a paper by Schlatt that says, and apparently, and there's also a reference, Heine also talks about this, the fact that Han may come from Na, by a phenomenon known as verbal attraction, as Heine describes it in his Proto-Bantu verb extension paper. So we get the syntax at this point in time, probably in Proto-Bantu was VO, auxiliary verb, preposition, noun. So there you have verb, preposition, and P, and then the preposition gets clinicized on the verb, and it develops into a full suffix out of the clinic. We see this grammaticalization synchronically. Himeni describes it in these two examples from Rwanda, where some sort of locative marking on the noun here in A gets clinicized onto the verb, and so the constituent that goes with that noun class also gets closer to the verb. My question here would be, what would be a possible etymology for it and other extensions if they come from prepositions? There's very scanty evidence for reconstruction of prepositions in BLR. So because of that, I am going to be methodological, opportunistic, and just go with the verb source, which is the second most famous, I guess, source that has been proposed for the Proto-Bantu extension. So we know that these things have sure cognates, at least in some Niger-Congo subgroups, like Gur, for example. So the time gap is very big. They go back a long way. It is very unlikely that we find any source morphology that can be unmistakably proven to be the right one. But one of the more, so the proponents of this possible origin were Enderman back in 1867, but it is Gibbon in 1971 that actually fleshes out this whole argument. So here the idea is that these things, the verbal extensions, verbal suffixes, originally they were finite main verbs. So at this point, the syntax of Proto-Bantu should have been of the verb auxiliary non-postposition. So we get a compound form of two verbs. Verb 1 is non-finite, verb 2 is finite, and it has tense aspect morphology on it already. Tom uses this reason, or Tom uses this, that he hypothesizes that to explain how it is that the tense aspect suffixes got stacked onto, the extensions, that the order isn't that way and not a different one. So at that point, we get that the verb 2 somehow becomes eroded, starts to criticize to the first verb. So the verb 2, remember, was the finite one that had all the tense aspect morphology information on it. And then we get full suffixation to the main verb, and we end up with verb 1 extension tense aspect. And he also has an argument as to why it is that we got from CBC to the most common shape of Bantu verbal extensions, which is BC. So if we started out with Proto-Bantu verb stems that are mostly reconstructed as CBC, then we just posit the loss of one of the two consonants of the second verb, the verb equidicized to the first one, and then we end up with BC. So the only etymology that I'm aware of for this scenario was proposed by Enderman in 1867, Proto-Bantu get flow, but it is attested only in zones C, E, J, and S. So because one needs to be brave, before being brave, let me also talk you through very briefly I did a little imperfect research. You can see that also on page 6 of your handout. If we do believe that these things came from finite main verbs, what have people said so far about verbs that develop into some sort of marker? What kind of verbs can develop into what kind of markers? And how do Proto-Bantu etymologies or verbs that we find reconstructed in the Bantu lexical reconstruction database fit or not fit what has been found out there in the literature? So this is why you have on page 6 and on this slide. So we know that, for example, benefactive markers can come from verbs like give or come. So in the second column, I put some attested directions of change where languages have been reported where a given verb like give evolves into a benefactive marker, or a verb like come becomes a benefactive marker. And in the third column, I put possible etymologies for Proto-Bantu, but to me, none of those look really good. If we go to allative, locative, we see that, unsurprisingly, verbs like go to, enter, take, but even give can evolve into a marker of allative or spatial goal. And in the third column, again, you have possible etymologies for Proto-Bantu that, I don't know what you think of it. Maybe you can tell me that they look really good. I'm totally wrong. Instrumental, the third line, also get verbs like get, take, pick up, use, hold, grasp, etc. widely attested. And then you have some possible etymologies. So my point here, they're all in red because none of these look really good to me to be a source for it. So now I'm going to be really brave and tell you that maybe the source of this morpheme was give. This verb, we like it because the g, we know, can easily go to 0. We have the same vowel, we have the same last consonant. It has a very broad translation, because those are not meaning. Those are what we see synchronically in the languages, but we don't know what that really meant back then. So it means act, do, say, have is attested in all zones, so that's a plus. Now, another thing that really got me excited is that do verbs can give rise to emphasis markers, such as the English case. He came versus he did come. This is also attested in other languages, such as in Monda, South, to do, developing into auxiliary used to emphasize the main verb action. And they can also develop into so-called perfective or accomplishment markers, which would tie in very well with type C, the idea of completeness, thoroughness, often described in the Bantu literature as perfectivity. And we also know that verbs like say can develop into subordinators. So again, that would explain why is it that this morpheme also shows up in subordinate clauses within Bantu. So this is what I would like to propose to do to you. And maybe we, here I am wildly speculating, but I discussed this with Tom Milan, and he said, maybe, why not? So I'm going to tell you, if the order was subject, object, verb 1, verb 2, oh, they got moved, oblique. So we started out with something like Musa, bread, buy, do, in the serial verb construction at market. So originally that meant Musa did buy bread at the market, and then because of overuse or high frequency, it just got reanalyzed somehow to mean that we needed that verb that then criticized to the main verb and then became a suffix to just introduce the locative argument. Of course, that's very speculative, but it's an idea that I would like to throw out there also to get some sort of feedback. And I would like to end here with this slide. This is my own understanding of things that are very new to me, but all people here are experts in this. So we have this Proto-Bantu verb template that has been proposed by Merson and Hyman in 2003. So we have the root, we have the causative and applicative morpheme, then the reciprocal, the causative and the transitive and the passive. So I'm going to explain a little bit the colors that you see there. The pink one indicates that Good in 2005 proposes that those things that are within pink squares probably had, he has really good arguments for that, they had a fixed order back in Proto-Bantu. The blue squares indicate that possibly, maybe, we can find or propose a verbal origin for those extensions. So the applicative proposed today, the causative, there has been some proposals for a verb that would have ended up being a causative suffix. We also know that some tense aspect suffixes have been linked possibly to a verbal source. Roseanne is going to talk soon about a possible verbal source for the passive suffix. And then we have this thing in the middle, the reciprocal, which is in a green square because most people say that it comes from a preposition. So my question here is, obviously different sources at different times, but how does this all fit together? And also Larry Hyman in 2003 suggests that very likely because of their phonological shape, the short causative, also called transitive-izer if I'm not wrong, and the passive suffix might be remnants of a voice marking system that might have a different source morphology compared to other extensions. So I wonder how this will happen. So conclusions and questions. Do you think that scenario 2 is plausible from a functional diachronic perspective? If subjects evolve out of topics, can object-related morphology come from focus constructions, or is that total nonsense? How does this fit, though, with the functional motivations for the existence of applicative constructions? For example, Peterson says that applicatives develop to be topic continuated devices. This is a terrible counter-argument to what I've been saying, but he also says, well, we have this focus function. I'm not talking about it because we don't know how it works, but maybe there are more functional motivations for the rise of applicative morphology than the ones we are aware of at the present stage. And finally, given the available evidence, very scanty as I have shown you, our relics are part of the Proto-Bantu applicative suffix id, if it is id, in fact, in WH questions in the Northwest, enough to claim retention of type B2, and so of the discourse function. And are those, are those relics enough to say this thing goes back all the way? Thank you so much for your attention.
We have 10 minutes for questions. Yes, Dimitri?
I'm very sympathetic with your talk, so I have 3 things to say. First, you give at least 3 different options, A, B, C, and they're probably related, so I do agree with you. And I also have the impression that your idea is that they're not related, that A comes from B or B comes from C, but they probably all come from one with something else.
Then maybe we have no evidence of what that something else was.
Yeah, so
yes.
it's not, you should not relate A to B and B to C, but something like X gives A, sometimes B, sometimes C. So
yes.
I have the impression that that's where you're leading to, but you haven't expressed it explicitly. So the first thing. The second thing about the scenario and possible source, the verbal source is most likely, to me, especially if you look outside of Bantu, with like Edoid, Yoruboid, and all the other wider Benue-Congo languages. And also, if you think that it may be preposition is also a functional morpheme, and in many Benue-Congo languages, they often come from verbs, sometimes from nouns, so it's not the ultimate source anyway. And third thing, so given the semantics of these marker, so I would suspect that it should be something, a directional verb movement, verb with directional movement, something like go, because it has something to do with it needs to have something to do with the locative argument, so because it's very frequent, and probably with go. And if you just take a verb like go, for instance, and you go from your wild scenario that Givon proposed, which I don't think is so wild, it's quite plausible. And if you have a verb like go, and you say something like he build goat, go bush. So the go sometimes is with a oblique and sometimes without. And so verbs like go or come, they often develop to reflective markers. And so when it's without an oblique, it can develop into a reflective marker. When it's with oblique, it can develop to like this applicative or focus on the oblique. So I'm not sure about the exact etymology. It's also maybe older than, it's probably older than Bantu itself, but I think that's the kind of semantic lexical field where you should look for these sources.
Can I answer? Thank you so much for so many useful comments. I agree with all of them. I desperately looked for a verb movement in the database, but I couldn't find any, but you're probably right. It's probably older than that. I mean, it's probably likely that that verb, a movement, if it existed, it's no longer
movement
there.
in very general, so maybe also puts or something like that.
Yes,
So,
but I tried all of those too. So that this one, I put it on the slides because it was like, I got excited because of the emphasis, with the focus. Why not?
Yes, Sara?
It would very much more justify all of this links to locative things. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe this is crazy, I'm just not thinking about it right, but this verb go, the low tone, could it have possibly been something like that plus this perfective ending, and that's where the D came from? And looking at these type C ones, the meanings, it just strikes me, they're very similar to the kinds of meanings that you see with duplication anyway. So do it a little bit, or do it often, or do it a lot. So those semantics are very familiar. So I never thought about that linking before, but
I think it's, I never thought about what you just said.
but yeah, so that's there's something really beautiful there, and I think you'll find that these meanings, even I'm thinking like, oh yeah, of course that meaning is there, and I just never thought about writing it down.
Exactly.
So I think they're probably much more widespread than you would find just by using the literature. So, yeah.
One more, only one more. Yes, Tom?
Well, just one, wouldn't you want to join to your C pattern the ile suffix? Because it's actually possible that it's a bimorphemic of it and an old perfected final form.
Thank you.
And then, well,
Yeah, I didn't know this.
yes, I know, but one would possibly still have, I know, but
Okay, thank you, Sara.